You can address me as Anil. Before I get into the session proper or some information that I would like to share as a kind of maybe a short little introduction on what addiction is. Of course, the session is very minimal in terms of trying to give you some in-depth knowledge and so on, but just an idea of what addiction is, which I think may be common knowledge for quite a lot of people. Maybe some people who are interested in this may be reading, or they know of a friend or a family member who may have run into some problems pertaining to addiction. What is lesser known is the role of counselling in the treatment of addictions, and some questions around whether, does counselling actually work? On the contrary, there may be people who think that, no matter how much counseling you do, doesn't seem to address fully the issues that people with addiction face. Well, I guess there are many, many different perspectives. And so far, I've not heard of any society where there's no people with addiction, right? So yes, currently my bread and butter is in lecturing. So I'm with Aventis Graduate School. I also lecture at the Singapore University of Social Sciences and the Management Development Institute of Singapore. So I've been a tertiary lecturer for about 12 years. I'm also a trainer with the other arm of Aventis called Aventis Learning Group. So you may see that we do have a lot of training courses for corporations, and I feature in some of those psychology-related ones. Prior to doing freelance lecturing, I was in the field of offender rehabilitation. So I ran a drug rehabilitation center. It's called a halfway house. I was there for about 5 years. Did mainly operational and management work, but I was also able to do some level of clinical work in terms of group counseling with my residents, right, who are all suffering from, or recovering rather, from drug addiction. 5 years there, I left. I joined the National Addictions Management Service, NAMS. NAMS is a department in the Institute of Mental Health that's under the purview of Ministry of Health. So at NAMS, I was doing something that I enjoy since I was young. It's called talking. I was a community outreach manager, and I went down to schools, community centers, army camps, organizations to talk about the various types of addictions and its prevention, right? So I'm here today not as a clinician per se, but more of someone who would like to share with you why we need to look at addictions from multiple perspectives. You could look at addiction from a social perspective in terms of its impacts, triggers, and maybe even explore why is it such a problem in society. And then, of course, you have the disease model that looks at addiction as a chronic disease, and that's where NAMS come in. And their aim is to offer people treatment to help them, recover from, or at least manage the disease. Right? So that's a bit about myself. So I titled my sharing "The Importance of Addiction and Counselling." Again, I'm here with a specific agenda. It's to try to get you interested in some of the things that I'm sharing, maybe leave you with more questions than answer. But I think more importantly is to justify why we are even advertising this. These days, information is out there everywhere, right? So if someone advertises something and don't have a justification for why this is needed, then I think it sounds like a very frail attempt or a scam, like, hey, come sign up for this. But then actually you find, hey, I don't know how this is going to be contributive. I think anything that we do, anything that we study need to have some contribution to specific sectors or even the country on its own. And I'm confident to say that addiction remains a problem that many societies, including Singapore, have to grapple with. So I've titled it "The Importance of Addiction in Counselling." There are lots of definition on what addiction means. I would think that a clinical definition is more appropriate. Right? So when we say something is clinical, usually there's a reference to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of mental disorder, or DSM. It's now in its fifth version, so we call it DSM-5. DSM-5 will map out all the various mental conditions, which includes addictions, right? So that's based on the official clinical definition and those criteria in terms of what an addiction entails. Right? The American Psychological Association, or APA in short, calls it a state of psychological or physical dependence, or both, on the use of alcohol or other drugs. Now, notice that this definition is somewhat limited. If you're sharp enough, you'll notice that the words alcohol and drugs are there, but addiction is not just simply about substances. Right? So this definition is a bit limited, but what I like about this definition is the emphasis that there is a psychological and physical dependence. Right? So, for example, namesake, people call me, wow, executive director of a halfway house. I call myself a manager of social problems. Right? Every day you go to work of problems. Why? Because these recovering individuals, by the time they reach the halfway house, they would have served, say, between 1 to 3 years of their prison sentence. And they don't come to the halfway house and present themselves to me, all like, I need the drugs, and then they're trembling and all that. No, they're fine. They've went through detox. They've gone through the treatment and they're okay. Probably after 2-3 weeks of going through detoxification, and all the withdrawals have been taken off, right? Or rather, they have weaned off the withdrawal. I tell you, they become Superman, they're like, hey, all right, I'm back, I'm okay now. And then, all the heroics come out, right? So by the time they arrive at the halfway house, or when they have weaned off all these dependence, right? The next thing that would face them would be their issues, right? The social issues, the triggers, right? The triggers that would attack their thoughts and their emotions and cause them to think about going back to drugs or substances or a behavioral problem that they may have, right? So I would say that psychological dependence part is probably the aspect in the field of counseling that we're looking at. I mean, physical dependence, it can be quite scary. And if you don't manage it well, the person is not taken care of medically, sometimes you could even suffer or die from it. I mean, I wouldn't discount that possibility, but most of the time they go through some medication. Cold turkey is very challenging, but over a period of, say, 14 days or so, they could get better. Right? Then after that, it's more of the psychological dependence part. Right? Now, the second definition complements the first and addresses the gap, right? A person with an addiction uses a substance, whatever the substance may be, or engages in a behavior for which the rewarding effects provides a compelling incentive to repeat the activity, despite detrimental consequences. So a couple of things here. You've got substance addiction and you've got behavioral addiction. Right? And behavioral addiction can range from several things, as you see in the third point: sex addiction, gambling, gaming, and some may even say, hey, if I shop too much, I go shopping, is that called an addiction? Well, you can Google it. There's actually a name for it. It's called oniomania, where someone becomes psychologically dependent on the act of shopping. Now, I would think that those are very extreme situations as well, right? So here you've got both substance and behavioral addiction, and I highlighted repeat the activity, right? So if you do it once, twice, and then you don't do it for, say, a period of 5-6 months, I don't think clinically we can diagnose that person as having an addiction, right? Addiction is a very chronic and repetitive set of behaviors that a person with addiction takes during the course of going through the addiction. Right, on a good note, addiction is treatable. It is a chronic medical disease that involves complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, so that's the nature part of it, but then it's also very nurture, where the environment and an individual's life's experiences do affect their problems with addiction. Before we watch a short little video, notice that I'm very careful with my words. I do not use the word addicts. right? Is this a case of playing with linguistics and so on? No, it's pretty much the same. We don't say a disabled person, but we say a person with disability or a person with schizophrenia, a person with addiction. There's no need to use the word addicts, right? The whole movement of fighting stigma and so on. So we don't want to label, we don't want to stigmatize. I think the correct word is to say people with addictions. Now, then there's also a possibility of mislabeling people, right? And before I get to some of my jokes to light up your evening, for example, I think if you attend my class in future, you probably have heard this. I don't know whether anybody in the audience have attended one of my class. So if you find the jokes familiar or similar, you can laugh again. I think it's good for your mental health. Right? If you see your neighbor having a kids and your neighbor come and tell you, hey, my child come back from school and then spend 3-4 hours playing games. After dinner, do a bit of homework, play games again, 5-6 hours, and then sometimes sleep at 1-2 a.m. next morning, go to school. Wow, your son play or your daughter play games a lot. I think addict. Right? My father was a former police officer, sometimes staying in the police station for many hours, doing all the cases and so on. I think back then the situation was rougher, So sometimes he ends off at, say, the wee hours of the morning, waits for the morning and he goes back home, right? So before he goes back home, sits down at the coffee shop, takes a rest, reads his newspaper, and have 2 bottles of beer. Right? Now, someone who doesn't understand the context, walk past the coffee shop, sees a person drinking alcohol in the morning. Wow, drinking alcohol in the morning, addict. You see how fast that escalated, right? But 7 p.m. at Clarke Quay, people wearing like me, roll up the sleeve, the hair ruffle a little bit, the blazer put behind style, having 2 pints of beer. Wow. That one hardworking corporate guy, 7 p.m. drink beer to unwind, justified. Now, I don't really care whether you work hard or not. My point is the context does matter. And sometimes society and the public mislabels people with addiction. And now that has consequences on people with addiction who are trying to get better. But I'm not here as some good Samaritan trying to save the people with addiction population. I'm just saying that when we use terms, clinical terms like addiction, we have to be very careful and know what this term entails before we use it in a very loose fashion. Right? Sorry, that's a bit of lecture mode in here. I will share my browser now and a short little video on what addiction is. Just give me a minute. Thank you for watching that with me. Well, I think some of the points that mentioned are useful from a layperson's perspective to understand what's going on with addictions, right? So something to highlight from the video is that when we talk about substance addiction, it's not just alcohol or drugs. I mean, even the whole category called drugs is like so varied, right? It could be anything from cocaine, heroin, marijuana. You could even consider codeine, right? Cough mixtures or sleeping pills, for instance. You got to consider next the whole nature-nurture argument. So these are areas of addiction that people tend to be interested in. They tend to ask. So quick question is, can you be born an addict, right? Or a person with addiction, right? Number 2, does biology have anything to do with addiction, or is this purely determined by our environment and who we socialize with and life circumstances, etc.? Right? I would say it's not nature or nurture, but it's nature and nurture. Now let's consider this. First point, many medical conditions have a genetic component, which means that a person is at risk for developing the condition if it runs in their family, hereditary. But it does not determine if the person will actually develop the condition. So you can't take that long shot and say that, oh, it runs in the family, right? So my grandmother passed away for diabetes. My father has mild diabetes. That means I will get diabetes. Well, you can't be certain for sure. And it doesn't determine, right? There is a genetic component, but it doesn't determine. So you saw in the video, that there was something called the dopamine part of things. So we call that the reward center in the brain. So you through senses when you take a substance or you engage in a behavioral activity, whatever it is, it causes certain transmission of information through the neurotransmitters and all this whole chunk of stuff on brain theory and how it works, and gives you that pleasurable feeling, right? These pleasurable effects gets you into a more positive mood, I would say. And because that mood is good, you like it, it serves as a reinforcement. So reinforcement is targeted at getting you to repeat the desirable behavior. For you, it's desirable because it has pleasurable effects. But from society's point of view, it's something not so good, or it's something wrong, or it's something problematic, right? Does this mean that we are condoning addictive behaviors, or are we saying that what people with addictions do is right? I don't want to get too moralistic out of it, but just a side point. I don't have things in my slide here, but just a side point. For drugs, if we are talking in the Singapore's context or whatever country, you need to understand that there are legal implications around it, right? And I don't want to get there because it's a sensitive topic. I don't want to debate whether or not Singapore should legalize marijuana and all that. I think this is a completely different trajectory across. But I'm just saying that apart from drugs, those class A, class B drugs or whatever, other things, smoking, vaping cannot, smoking, gambling, gaming, sex addiction, maybe engaging in any other kinds of activity, or maybe someone who has a voyeurism disorder, right? The voyeuristic disorder. I don't want to gross you out in case you're thinking that, I haven't had my dinner, why are you telling me about all these? But there are people who have fetishes. So you know that voyeuristic crimes have been on the rise. Recently, I read an article where this person has a fetish for smelling people's feet. Right? There are people who has fetishes for leather products that are owned by women. Right? There are also people who have fetishes for feces. Now, the point here is when they engage with such stimulus, these causes pleasurable effects for them, and they're likely to seek out these behaviors again and again and again. Now, for the rest of us who do not have this fetish, or we do not have to deal with the addiction, this is just wrong, or this is just bad, and this is just weird. Right? I get it. Right? Now, if you want to remain in that group of people, it's okay. You are free and entitled to judge. But if you are trying to come into a sector where you say that, okay, I think these individuals need help, but you still have that my neighbor's perception, right? Then I don't know, you better go and change a little bit of your attitude, because working with people with addiction, the last thing you want to do is to make unnecessary judgments and stigmatize and have lines saying that I think these people are screwed, they will never recover, this is going to be a problem, I don't know why they keep relapsing. Because the science tells us that this is a highly relapsing kind of condition. Right? People will fall back into it. So genetics does play a part. And if you look at my third point, it does increase the risk for addiction. However, addiction goes beyond family history and genetics. We need to consider environmental factors. And here I've summarized it for you. Childhood trauma, parenting styles, family background, influence of peers, lifestyle responses to stress, distress, and anxiety, as well as some other mental health conditions that could predispose individuals to addiction. Right? Some people ask me, hey Anil, why the heck is NAMS in IMH? I am an addict, but I don't have a mental illness. I'm not crazy. Why do you all put these services in the Institute of Mental Health? And then, I don't want to go there because it's very stigmatizing. Well, to use a very cliche line, it is not rocket science. Studies have shown that if you have an existing mental health condition or a mental illness, there is a chance that you might use substances or get into very repetitive behaviors to cope with your poor mental state. conversely, if you have addictions or you're dealing with addictions, there is a high chance that you might slip into a mental health condition like anxiety or depression. Right? I don't know. Find someone for me who is dealing with addictions and come to you and tell you that, hey, you know what? I think my mental health is great. I think that guy is lying through his teeth. Like, it's not possible. By default, I think if you are dealing with an addiction, your mental health is not good. In short, addiction risk is a mix of factors. Before we go in to understand what is counseling in relation to addiction, I think we need to first appreciate that addiction involves behaviors. So behaviors refers to actions, any actions. Right? In psychology, we have a very basic framework. We call it the ABC of psychology, or the affective component, the behavioral component, and the cognitive component. So by cognition, in layman terms, we say it's your thoughts, your system of thinking, the way you think, the way you perceive, etc. So the thoughts connect with cognition. And then you have the affection, right, which is your emotions, your feelings. And then behavioral pertains to the action. A very simple equation: any action must necessarily be understood in relation to the thoughts and the feelings or the emotions of an individual. Right? So to be able to understand addictive behaviors, we need to understand the thought process and the interplay of different kinds of primary and secondary emotions that an individual may be experiencing at one time, right? Before we can make sense of the behaviors. Right? Simply stigmatizing or dismissing the person as crazy or having a big problem is not very helpful to treat a person who has addictions. To address addictive behaviors, we do use medication-assisted treatment, which we call medication as a whole, especially for substance addiction. So if they go on cold turkey, doctor will give them some medication because, you got to manage that, right? What if a person gets into a cardiac arrest, right? Because they're dealing with the withdrawal symptoms and it's so bad that they can't deal with it. So there's definitely MAT, medication-assisted treatment. Now, beyond medication-assisted treatment, when the person has already become less dependent and there's no withdrawal symptoms, for example, we then need to address the psychological dependence. So that's where therapy will come in. And in therapy, we examine the thoughts and emotions behind those behavior. Right? I'm trying to put all these things in layman terms, and in Aventis Graduate School, that's pretty what I do. I don't think I'm someone with some mind-blowing IQ, but I would think that I'm someone who has very high EQ, and my students have shared that one of my strengths, and I thank them for that, is to put very difficult concepts or abstract concepts into very layman terms, right? So my KPI, or key performance indicator, is to ensure that if I speak to my neighbor about all this, he understands. If he understands, then I guess I do a good job, right? That's the point, because some of these are jargons, very clinical things. And when we speak to our clients and we start using jargons, they may not be able to connect with us, right? So I would think that my 7-8 years working in the field of addiction has helped me, because I had to understand that the people I'm dealing with, may want me to address their issues in a very simple, practical manner, some things that they can understand, especially when you are trying to educate them about, for example, the relationship between their thoughts, emotions, and actions. Now, counseling, if I can broadly define it, it is a professional relationship that empowers diverse individuals, families, and even groups to accomplish mental health, wellness, education, and career goals. Right? So this is not addiction counseling yet, but this is counseling in general. Right? Notice that I bolded the words professional relationship. So it's not your fly-by-night thing, or some of you got good friends, right? You call them at 3:00 and tell them that you got girlfriend, boyfriend problem. Then they speak to you until 5:00. They ask you, do you feel better? And then you say yes. And then they are very happy, they say, yeah, I'm a counselor. Cannot like that. Everybody is a counselor, outside. It is a professional relationship whereby there are certain ethical guidelines that guides the behaviors of the client and the therapist, for instance, right? Now, our aim here is not to show off our profession or try to be the best counselor in the country, but it's to empower diverse individuals, right? Meaning individuals can come from all walks of life. Sometimes we deal with their family members because the root causes of the problems could involve family members. Counseling can also be done in a group setting. So you can have individual counseling, you can also have group counseling, but the guidelines and the modalities would be different. Right? Now, a counselor works with families, caregivers to help individuals better understand their social and psychological needs. Now, don't go in as a counselor and say that you got physical withdrawal symptom. Is it? Come, let me help you with it. Hey, please, you are not a medical doctor, okay? You don't have the MBBS, right? So I also don't have MBBS, so you better keep quiet. Let the medical professionals do the medical treatment part. Don't overpromise. Sometimes, we care workers or social service workers, we get a bit too excited and then we overpromise people. And then they say, hey, I thought you could help my son or my daughter who is having a problem here. Right? I think as a counselor, we can address both the social and psychological needs. You help your clients develop skills, access resources, or tap on their support services. I think more importantly is to help them to manage negative thoughts and their emotions around their problems. Right? So counselors deal with a variety of issues, right? Everything from financial problems, dealing with your disability, addiction is there, delinquent behavior, study stress, work-related problems, marital issues, etc. Often, a counselor has to interview clients individually, in families or in groups, so i.e. a therapy session. They have to assess their current situation and help them develop strategies and plans for the future. Right? I think that's what a counselor would focus on. A psychotherapist is different, right? They are usually better trained at digging up the past. So a psychotherapist in a psychotherapy would go further back to understand a person's history, their past, and maybe try to relieve some potential traumatic childhood issues that could affect them currently. A counselor doesn't go there, not because they can't, but they're not trained in doing psychotherapy, and also, they don't have, for example, a qualification in psychology. But with a qualification in counseling, you can address immediate problems and help a person to get from point A to point B being a position that is more favorable. I wouldn't say it's the best, but I would say it's more favorable. They also have to plan and implement assistance program for clients, which includes crisis intervention. Not talking about your COVID-19 crisis or hotel New World collapse crisis kind of thing, but I'm talking about a personal crisis. And oftentimes, if they need to have referrals to relevant agencies or even maybe see a psychiatrist for certain problems, I think counseling can offer that. Now, if we talk about addiction counseling, then I would think that addiction counseling involves counseling people with addictions, whatever they may be, right? Substance or behavioral addiction. But we use evidence-based and holistic treatment modalities to ensure that the counseling is done in a professional, right, timely, and credible scientific way, and not some uncredible, unverifiable ways of doing things, and that might feel that as if you're cheating people. Right? So it's evidence-based, the treatment is holistic, and of course there are many other qualities of an addiction counselor which I think is needed. Right? So you must be able to empathize, you must be non-judgmental, and you may be faced with many different scenarios that could be beyond your wildest imagination, right? So early on, if I say, you come face to face with someone who is a voyeur, and this person has a fetish, for instance, that is beyond you, right? And you think that if people who have such fetishes, they are really nuts and they are disgusting or they're crazy. I don't think it's wrong for us to have those opinions because it's a personal opinion. But if that is going to interfere with how you deal with the client at the professional level, I would say you better rethink your own personal biases because this is not a walk in the park. And I'm not saying that a fireman's job is easier or a customer service job is easier. Every job has its difficulty, but when you deal with people with addictions, you've got to be prepared for things that can surprise you, for things that could make you feel emotions on your own, right? And if this is going to impede you and hinder you, the way you empathize with them, it could pose a potential problem in the therapeutic relationship. Now, an addiction counselor essentially addresses the underlying causes of addiction, or to use a very business term, right? You do an analysis of the root causes of addiction. What is actually triggering them to repeat the behavior again and again? Sometimes we look at superficial reasons, we don't dig further. Right? An addiction counselor would do that. The person with addiction, third point, needs to recover from the medical condition. Counseling is then targeted at improving the recovery outcomes. Right? So at this juncture, allow me to share a personal experience in this area of dealing with people with addiction and how we see them. Right? Nothing personal, as in not me. I have not suffered from any addiction before. I never been diagnosed and so on. Well, I did dabble with tobacco or nicotine, smoking in the past. I stopped. Alcohol consumption never got too compulsive, but just very social. But around me, I've seen people who've gotten into serious trouble with this. Now, when I was in the halfway house, I work very closely with Ministry of Home Affairs and the Singapore Prison Service, right? Because you know that with drugs, you consume drugs or you traffic drugs or you possess drugs, it is an offense. And you'll be charged and incarcerated. There's no such thing as a fine, pay money. It doesn't. Now, from the Ministry of Home Affairs perspective and from the prison's perspective, if you are an addict, you serve your time, right, i.e. incarceration. So from their perspective, you are a bad person trying to be good. Because prisons are called correctional facilities, you see. They want to correct your behavior. So addictive or addiction involves behaviors. And so I need to correct your behaviors. So I get that. Now, when I went to NAMS in IMH, that's under MOH, Ministry of Health. Over there, people don't see addicts as bad trying to be good. When you go to NAMS and you have an addiction, you are a sick person trying to get better. Now, these are two very different narratives, but in Singapore, no choice, right? You must have interministerial collaboration and all that. But I tell you, on itself, I don't think these two groups of people see eye to eye. Right. And I'm not here trying to spread falsehood and so on, because it's two very different line of thinking. One see addiction as a disease and that we need to help. Another see it as fundamentally a behavioral problem. That's antisocial, never think of consequences, a bad person, basically. Right. So typically a person with addiction in Singapore's context go through these two problems, you see. One, they're labeled as someone who has committed a crime. Two, they're also a sick person trying to recover from an addiction. Now, I think this double stigma sometimes make it very difficult for them to recover. And I think addiction counselors play a very important role in trying to get them back up on track. So developing a plan of treatment, helping them to develop effective coping strategies to manage their addiction. And of course, once treatment is complete, we cannot assume that they do not fall back into the problem, right? Studies have shown that addiction is a highly relapsing condition. And therefore, aftercare is needed to ensure that a person maintains their recovery. I think that's the most difficult part. For example, I can be very motivated to do something. I could have all the energy and I have a direction. Those are essential elements for motivation. But I think what is most important in motivation to do something is what we call persistence. in the face of adversity, in challenging times, can you keep up that motivation? Right? Some of us call it resilience, whatever, that's a heavily used word these days. Right? But I'm just saying that if you can't persist, then you are likely to fall back into the same problem. And I think that's something that people with addiction goes through. And that's why you have cases of, people going in and out of prisons so many times. And family members look at me and say, I don't understand. You all have you have counseled him until the cows came home. You've given him all the treatment that you can. He goes into prisons, he starts to become a holy person. Every day he prays, every day he says he will change. He is remorseful, he or she is remorseful, blah, blah, blah. Come out from prisons or the treatment center, 3 to 6 months later, relapse. Well, the environment and the wind is different, you see. It's not about physical dependence only. I think it's very psychological. This whole relationship that they have with the substance and the behavior that they were once addicted to. Right? Now, how can we try to understand that? That's what I'm saying. So individual group therapy. And I think I want to close out this small little session by saying that, if you are trying to come into this line of working with people with addictions, 5 years in a halfway house, I think I lost some hair. Thankfully, still got some, but it's already getting off. But 5 years there, I tell you, it was a tough job, right? It's not an easy occupation dealing with people who have a lot of challenges and dealing and grappling with addiction. So self-care becomes very important, because if you don't take care of yourself, I'm not sure whether you can last through working with clients and their challenges, right? And as I shared, relapse rate for addiction is very high, which means you will be faced with a lot of disappointments during the period of your career. And if you are someone who is a perfectionist and disappointment is going to get you really sad and so on, you got to address that first, right? I would like to end off with an anonymous quote. This was shared with me by someone who was recovering, right? I have never recovered from addiction. I am always recovering. There is no such thing as being fully recovered from addiction. There is no such thing. It's never past tense, but you are always in the process of recovery. What this means is that there will always be the need for people in this sector who can work with people with addiction to help them to manage the problem.